again, my good old friend Mel. Listen, we've been away too long, and it's always, I know that you are always doing research and you're coming up with all kinds of new ideas. And here we are again. I'm traveling. I'm in Brazil. Can you tell? This is not my home. This is not my room. This is not even the air I'm used to breathing. I'm in a huge, huge city here in the southern part of Brazil. And we're doing a Zoom recording on some new material that Mel has come across. Fascinating. Because one of the things that we have always questioned concerning the Standard Islamic Narrative, Mel, has been this notion that it gets its dates right, it gets its categories right, it even gets its scenarios right. And what we're finding out, it does nothing of the sort. In almost every one of our episodes that you and I have done, you have pointed out hole after hole after hole after hole where the Standard Islamic Narrative completely misconstrues what happened historically and overlays its own history, its own narrative onto what was the real history. There are some aspects of it that are true. There may be even the names that are true. It sometimes even gets the places that are true. But in almost in every case, it gets the date wrong. And most of the time, it has the wrong place with the wrong people at the wrong time. And here you've come up with another one of where the Standard Islamic Narrative gets it wrong yet again. And what you have done, and this is what I love about you, Mel, you're always going back to the 7th century. You're always going back to when the history took place. And you're asking history, what does history show us from there? And you're going to show us that this whole RIDDA war, this war of apostasy and some of the expansion of Islam immediately after Muhammad's death. So he died in 632. You're going to show us how in almost every case they even got that wrong. So over to you. Help us out. Where do we go? And what are we going to find?
Yeah, so, well, we could say that the Standard Islamic Narrative, as we understand it today, has it wrong. But actually, if you go back to the early records, there's a guy called Saif ibn Umar, and it looks like he's got things wrong. It looks like he's got the Hijra year wrong, but we're assuming that he's using the same notion of the year of the Arab as we have it today. But as we're going to find out, if we look at the idea that the year of the Arab began in 618, which is something we've explored before, and we plug that in, suddenly we find that everything makes sense. And it's fascinating. The work of Parvaneh Pourshariati, who's an Iranian scholar, she's done amazing work, very in-depth study of the decline of the Persians. What she found was that when she looked at his work and ignored the Hijra and just looked at the different monarchs that it mentions, and she lined it up with Iranian sources, it suddenly made sense. And she was able to come up with different years to when it happened. And actually what's interesting is she pushes all of the dates back about 4 years. Now, what I did as an experiment, I remembered discussing the idea of the year of the Arab being 618, and I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be interesting if I take Saif's dates, the year of the Hijra, and assume that he's really talking about 618 instead of 622, plug it into a table, see what years it generates in terms of AD, and then compare it side by side with what she proposed as the year of the battles. And lo and behold, as we'll see later, they line up perfectly. And I think it's beautiful because it shows that what she was saying based on a different set of evidence lines up with what I've been saying in terms of looking at 5 sources which talk about the year of the Arab being really 618 and not 622. That's the early notion before they change it later.
Just so people are clear, before we get into this,
yeah,
what we know as the Hijra, what Muslims and what the Standard Islamic Narrative has always told us is that the Hijra is 622. That's when Muhammad moved from Mecca up to Medina and took about 80 or 200 followers, and then started his Khilafat. That's 2 years later in Medina in 624. So 622 is very important for Muslims because that's the beginning of the calendar as well. And it starts. So whenever you see AH, it's always after Hijra, which is 622. So it's foundational to everything Muslims know, believe, and also are taught, but also for their whole calendar and also for their whole sense of history. So what you're doing is you're confronting this whole notion of age. You're also confronting, I think, secondarily, this notion that the RIDDA Wars, these apostate wars, which according to the Standard Islamic Narrative start immediately after Muhammad's death in 632. So immediately after that, his death, that you have Abu Bakr and Umar, especially those two who are confronting these apostates, these people who are rebelling. And almost all of that rebellion is happening, according to the Standard Islamic Narrative, down south in what we know today as Arabia. So let's go ahead and let's just take a look and see which is correct historically.
A good place maybe to start before we go into the thick of it is maybe to have a look at that map of the RIDDA Wars.
Okay, here's the RIDDA Wars. There is the RIDDA Wars. Wherever you see two swords crossed, that is the RIDDA Wars. And if you look, this is the RIDDA Wars from 632. Well, take a look where they are. They're all in basically in where the central part of Arabia, which is all desert today. So Yamama is the famous one. That's the one in 632. And it is those ones, each one of boom, 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 where Islam, according to Standard Islamic, moved out and pulled people back. They were rebelling now that Muhammad was dead.
You know, the interesting thing, Jay, according to Saif, he talks about the various wars of conquest happening from 632 onwards. Yet we're expected to believe that the Arabs were fighting among themselves, having these apostasy wars, and yes, waging wars of conquest going up along the Euphrates, starting in Basra. There's a bit of a contradiction there. And the other thing is, if these dates are wrong, in terms of the secondary battles, the battles of conquest, if those dates get pushed back, where does that leave us with the RIDDA Wars? It means that there's something seriously wrong. It means that if there were these RIDDA Wars, they're happening 4 years earlier. And where does that leave us with Muhammad dying in 632, which is supposed to be the impetus for these apostasy wars when they started to doubt the faith and so on. So it creates a massive crater in the Standard Islamic Narrative once we start changing these dates. So I think that's a good place to start. So
just before you start, it's fascinating because even Wikipedia agrees with you. If you go up on the article on the RIDDA War, look at the introductory part of the article, the last sentence does admit what you just said. There are some contradictions with the dates and some contradictions with these wars, which makes it difficult for those who are studying it. And you're going to show just how contradictory they are and why this is causing such a problem.
Yeah, and actually, because of that sense of that these dates are contradictory, I actually didn't believe any of the sources about these battles because I just thought, well, they're all just unreliable, ahistorical. But what's interesting is Pourshariati makes a brilliant case when she actually looks at the politics that was happening in Persia and looks at Saif's account. It lines up perfectly. He knows what he's talking about, and he does talk about the infighting among the Persians. He does mention names, and she was able to find these names, and actually sometimes he gets the spelling wrong, as you'd imagine, because he Arabizes some of the names, but she was able to unpick all of those and get the dates. So it's quite incredible. So let's share my slides. Okay, so I'm using the phrase conquest and apostasy wars to kind of cover it all really because that is the title for Saif's book. So when did they really happen? So this is Parvaneh Pourshariati, who wrote this amazing book. It's a very long book. It took me pretty much most of the summer. It's really dense material. She's really meticulous. I've become an instant fan of her scholarship. I think she's the best scholar since Patricia Crona. She's just so meticulous, fluent in multiple languages, and is just fantastic. Doesn't let up. She's constantly looking at evidence. Really good. So if you've got the time, she's well worth delving into. Okay, so Saif ibn Umar is an 8th century Islamic historian and compiler of reports who lived in Kufa. And his book, The Great Book of Conquest and Apostasy Wars, is one of the sources that is being used. And also there are multiple Iranian sources which are also used to compare that, and these are discussed in her book. So Saif's account of the initial phase of the conquest of Iraq begins with a very significant chronological and symbolic indicator. When Khalid bin Walid was done with the business of Yamama, Abu Bakr, 632-634, wrote to him, "Go onward toward Iraq until you enter it. Begin with the gateway to India, which is Bula, which is Basra. Render the people of Persia and those nations under their rule peaceable." Now, Yamama was where Khalid had defeated the pseudo-prophet Musaylima. The signifier at the very inception of Saif's account, therefore, is the RIDDA Wars conducted under the direction of Abu Bakr. And this is quoted directly from her book. So wherever you see her reference underneath, you'll know it's from her and not my words. Okay. So the accepted Hijra chronology provided by Saif, moreover, puts the start of these wars in 12 AH, which is conventionally dated to 633. Okay. Now, so the idea with the RIDDA Wars is that Muhammad dies and then you have the RIDDA Wars. That's the chronology. So if he died in 632, the RIDDA Wars happened afterwards. Obviously, there is one problem. The only contemporary reference to Muhammad that we have, at least an early one, is Thomas the Presbyter, who names as someone called Muhammad, but puts him near Gaza in 634. So that's a problem, straight off. That doesn't fit in with Islamic narrative. So if we look
just
at
one other thing,
yeah,
you know, we do have that. We also have the coin with Muhammad's name on it about the same, just a little bit later than that. And it also has the person who is referencing Muhammad holding a cross, which suggests that whoever this Muhammad was is a Christian from the coin, and also Thomas the Presbyter's reference.
Absolutely. So
too far north and the wrong religion.
Yeah. So it's a bit of a mess if Muslims are looking to get confirmation of the Islamic narrative from these early sources. They're not going to find it. It's a mess. If we look at this first battle, then the Battle of Basra, essentially, if we use the word today, the Sin would place it in 633. So here's what Pourshariati has to say. Now, these raids, as they're called, are described under the year 12 of Hijra and are said to have been directed by Abu Bakr after the defeat of Musaylama. Who were the Persian commanders participating in the Battle of Abula, however? And what are the Sasanian chronological indicators for this battle? So she asks the question that so many scholars have ignored. It's asked the honest question. Well, who was running the show in the Persian areas at this time? And they simply just ignored the fact that they have dates for these people and they haven't tried to line them up. But people have been tied to the Hijra date and just ignored this much more important indicator of the chronology. So she goes on to say that during the course of this war, Khalid wrote to Hormuz and urged him to become a Muslim or opt to pay the jizya. So there's a specific person that we can date. At the receipt of Khalid's letter, Hormuz sent the news to Shir-Uyi, Kubad, and to Ardashir III, after which he mobilized his forces. And she goes on to say, unlike Saif's account, where there is a confusion as to whether this war took place during Kubad's reign, 628, or during Ardashir's reign, which goes from 628 630. However, Ibn al-Athir maintains that the Battle of Abula took place during the reign of Ardashir III. Now, if we look at Ardashir III's reign, it has to be between 628 and 630. Okay? That's a good bit away from 633. So even there, just the mere fact that Saif refers to Ardashir III means that the idea that it's happened in 633 is being shot straight away. It has to be a few years before that. Okay. Now, what she did next is she had a little thought experiment. She said, well, what if we throw out the Hijra dating and then just look at it independently of that and just let the evidence lead us? So that's what she does next. So she says, if we continue to uphold the accepted Hijra dating of these events, this objection would be valid. What would happen, however, if, as we suggested at the beginning of this chapter, we chose to ignore the Hijra date altogether, and even if we admit the participation of Khalid bin Walid in these raids, presume that these raids, in fact, did take place around the time when Shahruyeh Kubad died and the 7-year-old child Ardashir III was enthroned. So that's the time frame we're looking for. Would this alternative chronological scheme make sense if we compare it to the information that we have now garnered about Ardashir III's reign from the Hawadeh Namag tradition, which is an Iranian source, and other sources? She goes on to say that now Ardashir III ruled for about 1 year and 7 months until Sharvaraz usurped the Sasanian throne on the 27th of April, 630. Based on our alternative chronology, therefore, the Battle of Abulla would have taken place any time between September 628 and April 630. So we got a really narrow window when this could have occurred. And this is somewhere between 7 and 9 AH. However, since some of the accounts still mention Kubad, we should conclude that this battle probably took place sometime in 7 AH or 628 CE or AD, as I prefer. Okay, so that's the year she gives it. What does the Standard Islamic Narrative tell us? It's basically 633. That's 5 years out. So that's a massive difference. Who do I trust? I trust her dating because it's based on the Sasanian ruler at the time. It has got no axe to grind. It's the Iranians recorded their own reigns, and this is also what Saif tells us. So I think she's on solid ground there. So the conclusion is simply that the sin places in 633, and yet the dating that she would give us based on both Arabian and Iranian sources, 628 CE. We must conclude either that there was no RIDDA Wars or they occurred when Muhammad had he existed, was still alive. So my own hunch here is that the RIDDA Wars were in fact a time of chaos that began when Khusrow died in 628, and the Persians were divided a week due to the Parthians' withdrawal of support from the Sasanians, and that this memory of that time of chaos got morphed over time into the idea that it was over apostasy. And actually, I think this was something you were talking about, Jay, before we record the videos, that it was to do with internecine battles among the Persians.
Yeah, this to me is typical, I think, of what the later narratives do. Certainly what we do know from even the traditions, the Standard Islamic Narrative of Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, all the others, Tabari especially, you have redacting back onto what things that were happening then, but they put their own narrative into it and they put their own spin to it. And you can see, obviously, this was going on. This was something that really did happen. There were lots of rivalry going on within the Sasanian courts. You're going to be giving example after example after example of just that. Taking and knowing that that existed, they just interposed it into the Apostasy Wars, into the RIDDA Wars. And that is what you're exposing now, just by putting it up those four years. But this is what I like. We've known this about the Standard Islamic Narrative, but here's just another example of where this redaction is going on, and it's intentional to fit their narrative.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's as we'd kind of say, it's kind of accidental in a way as well, because at some point later they changed their notion of when the year of the Arab began. So for whatever reason they changed it from 618 to 622. probably because that was the turning point. Heraclius started to win against the Persians, and so at some point they decided actually that was the key point and not 618. Perhaps because from 618 to 622 it was very piecemeal attacks into other areas. It wasn't that significant really, and then they changed their mind. And so when they did that, it's hard to say. It's probably late in the 8th century, or perhaps even into the 9th century, that they made that switch. And I think somewhere along the line, I think we'll find a witness to that change of dating system. I think that would be really helpful. But I'm pretty confident that there was that switch, as we'll see later when we look at the evidence for the 618 start. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next battle, the Battle of Dat al-Salasil. Again, like the last one, it's said to have occurred in 12 AH or 633 AD. The battle that subsequently took place between Khalid and Hormuz is called the Battle of Dat al-Salasil. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, and I think it's probably worth mentioning. When we're talking about the Year of the Arabs, don't assume that it began in January and finished in December. It would have happened mid-year if we take it in terms of Anno Domini. So there's going to be an overlap between that and the year as we give it in terms of AD. Okay, so just bear that in mind. She says, significantly, Blankenship notes that this battle, which is reported only by Saif, has the same name as the expedition of Amir bin Alas in the year 629, where it refers to a place. This war has also been reported by Ibn Hisham, Waqidi, and Ibn Sa'id in the Sirah, Kitab al-Makazi and Tabakat al-Kabir, respectively, as having taken place during the year 8 of Hijrah, that is 629. Okay, so it's interesting that elsewhere, other Arabic scholars are placing it essentially in 629. Also, what's interesting here is the idea that a battle associated with Khalid is also associated with Amir bin Alas. And Red Judaism argues that these two people are one and the same person. So it's interesting, she's saying something very similar to what he said, you know. She goes on to say, in other words, if we follow the Sasanian chronology and compare it to the events described for the year 8 of Hijrah in other Arabic sources, then this war took place probably in 629. She goes on to say that Hormuz, who was from the highest nobility among the Persians and from one of the 7 houses, was killed in the Battle of Dat al-Salasil, whereas Anushjan and Kubad escaped. Now, what's interesting is Al-Tabari, talking much later or writing much later, denounced Saif's account for throwing a spanner in the works, essentially. She says, towards the end of this narrative, furthermore, Tabari takes the rare and unusual step of denouncing Saif's story, observing that the narrative as we have it is different from what the true traditions have brought us. For the Battle of Ubula was only in the days of Umar, when it was accomplished in the hands of Utbah in the year 14 of the Hijrah. So he puts it way further in 635, 636. So you can see over the passage of time, there's a drift going on in terms of the dating. So he thinks Saif is unreliable, but actually Saif was spot on with his dating. It's the later Tabari that's really wrong with this. I don't know if you want to jump in on any of this at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we were saying earlier, and that is, in so many respects, Tabari would be representing the Abbasid narrative, which you've talked about many times, Mel. You refer to this all the time about the narrative coming from the Abbasids is very much has an agenda with it, and that's true. You can see it right here, and he is confronting Saif. But it's fascinating. It's actually that Tabari was wrong, because Tabari didn't look at the Sasanian. He didn't look at their writings, which Pourshariati, or I think it's Pourshariati, How do you pronounce her name? Por or Pur?
I'm not sure. You can go. I think we can go with either one. I'm not sure. I would
You know
maybe
what?
poor. I'm
She
not
is
sure.
bringing this up, and it's good because once again we have said this over and over again. The Islamic narratives are not only too late; they're too far north. But not only that, they have an agenda. They absolutely hated the Umayyads and anything that earlier, and so they're putting their agenda onto it. They're making it a religious war when it has nothing of the sort. It was a political. These are political battles. This is quite normal whenever you have a great king die.
Yeah.
And whenever a king dies, you're having a jostling back and forth for position. So I'm not surprised what she's coming up with here. That all the more supports the notion that this is more historical, because it's not surprising that there was a jockeying for position as people were trying to take over and trying to, as you're going to give some examples of that exactly going on. When has that never? It happens in every change of leadership. And especially in those contexts when you didn't have democratic institutions, when you had really whoever had the most power, whoever controlled or had the best strategies was the one that won out. Well, that's exactly what Pourshariati is finding out. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
How this is reinterpreted by Tabari and many of the others is, no, this is getting people back to Islam again, because that's their narrative. That's what they wanted to believe.
Yeah.
No, they've got, once again, the narrative is we're catching up the narrative and saying, go back and see what history really says.
Yeah. If you go back early enough, you're going to get closer to the truth. It just makes logical sense. The further you go ahead in time, things get shifted, things get distorted, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to
embellish all the rest. That's what you would expect. Okay, back to you again.
The conclusion then for that battle, the Sen says it happened in 633. Al-Tabari says it happened 635 to 636. However, she has found that it happened more likely 629 AD, or 4 years earlier than the Sen. So the next battle we're going to look at is the Battle of Madar. And again, the Sen places in 12 AH or 633. So these battles are happening chronologically, one after the other. She says that according to Saif, when Khalid bin Walid had written to Hormuz, urging him to become a Muslim or pay the jizya, Hormuz had in turn written to Shuriyi, Kudad, and Ardashir III and informed them of the content of the letter and the fact that Khalid had set out from Al-Yamamah against him. The child Ardashir III allegedly responded to Hormuz's warning of impending warfare by sending one Karen to his aid. She says that the internal evidence provided by Saif on both of the major figures involved in the Battle of Madar and his contention that these were active during the regency of Ardashir III, 628-630, continues to tally with the course of events transpiring in Iran as we have reconstructed these based on the Hawadeh Namag tradition. And she goes on to refer to the internal logic. She says that presumably before reaching Hormuz, however, Karen and his forces hear of his defeat and death, since Hormuz had been killed in the Battle of Dat al-Salasil, which took place prior to the Battle of Madar. The army commanded by Hormuz needed indeed a new commander, hence the dispatch of the Parthian general Karen. And she argues that Saif's knowledge is sound. He knows what he's talking about. Karen arrived at the scene only to intercept the remnants of the fleeing army of Hormuz. Faced with the withdrawal of Sasanian forces, they encouraged each other to turn to the fight once more. Who were these people encouraging each other? Saif provides crucial evidence. The remnants of the forces of Al-Hawaz and Fars said to the remnants of Al-Sawad and Al-Jabal, if you split up, you will never join together afterwards. Therefore, join together to go back to fight once more. So what we can see here is that the Persians had two camps, as it were, and they're encouraging each other to remain united. So she goes on to say, two groups of people are here distinguished, the forces of Afaz and Fars, and 2, the forces of Sawad and Jibal. As the regional power of the Pahlav was partially in the north, here identified with Sawad and Jibal, under the leadership of Mahadar Jusnas and Karen, it follows that the forces of Hormuz must have hailed from Avaz and Fars, that is, from the Parsic domains. So just a little note before going any further. So the Pahlav are the Parthians, so they typically were up in the north. The Parsic were the Sasanians, and they would have been further south, okay, just to make it a little bit easier. Hence, we are dealing here with a regional distinction.
Just so people know, when you say south, you don't mean Central Arabia, you mean south and east. So you're talking more about what it to where today Iran would be.
Yeah, we're talking south in terms of Iran, not in terms of Arabia here, because we're talking about the Persians. Yeah.
I know, just so people don't get confused. So the Sasanians were what Sasanians were basically where Iran is today. So that's not in Arabia.
Yeah. So hence we are dealing here with a regional distinction, north versus south, onto which a different sort of division is superimposed, the Pahlav versus the Parsic. Okay, so a lot of people think of the Iranians as one monolith, but actually there were regional powers, and the Sasanians had been ruling for centuries. The earlier rulers had been the Parthians, and they were, at this stage, they were second base, as it were. They didn't have the power, but they wanted to be in power, and so there was a natural tension between these two. Now that the Arabs were attacking, there was obviously an incentive to unite, at least temporarily, so that they didn't lose their kingdoms. But their unity didn't hold out very well, which is why the Arabs took advantage. She goes on to say that Hormuz was defeated and killed in the Battle of Dat al-Salasil, which according to some sources took place during the year 8 of Hijra, 629, precisely during the rule of Ardashir III. When Hormuz died and his army was on the verge of withdrawing, however, the regional armies warned each other that to disperse would mean disaster. The command of the forces was then taken over by the Parthian general Karen. So in conclusion with all of that, we can see again that there's a mismatch. The Sen says that this battle happened in 633, but if we look at both the Arab sources and we look at the Iranian sources, we see a date of around 629 to 630. So big difference between the two. So we're going to move on to the Battle of Walaja, which the Sen again places in 633. So it would have happened straight after. The Battle of Walaja, described next and placed among the wars taking place in 12 AH. The news of the defeat and murder of Karen reached Ardashir III. Once Hormuz and Karen were dead, Ardashir III, or rather the factions in control of the child Ardashir III, because he was a young boy, sent a figure called Andargar to the war front. The command of the Andazargar, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, however, was not accepted, and Bahman Jadhuyi was sent in his stead. People then joined Andarzargar and Bahman Jadhuyi to engage the Arabs at the Battle of Walaja. She gives a note that explains that this name, which is difficult for me to pronounce, refers to his role as counselor. The word gar means a position, a role. So a lot of people might have thought that this is a name of a person. It's actually just a title for a role.
The name, the pronunciation is Andarzgar.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay.
Andarzgar.
Yeah.
So it's close enough.
I apologize to viewers. I tend to butcher these names, but I think the idea is probably for me is much more important than the pronunciation. But apologies to any Iranian viewers. She goes on to say that as we recall from the Hawade Namag tradition, however, Ardashir III's reign was thoroughly tumultuous. The Persians were therefore yet again defeated at the Battle of Walaja. So the conclusion of this again is The Sen says it happened in 633. The sources indicate 629, 630. So our next battle is the Battle of Ulays, which occurred in 633 again. So these are literally just very quick battles happening, straight after each other. With the narrative of the War of the Battle of Ulays, which is still taking place in the year 12 of Hijra, according to Saif, we are given further significant internal Sasanian chronological indicators. Bahman, Saif informs us, was the spokesman of Persia on one day out of their month. They divided their months so that each month consisted of 30 days. On each day, the Persians had a different spokesman who was appointed to speak for them before the king. Their spokesman was Bahman. On the second day of the month, the child Ardashir III supposedly wrote to the spokesman for the Persians and ordered him to go forth in order to engage the Arabs. Bahman, however, disobeyed Ardashir III's orders and sent Jaban in his stead, ordering him to not engage the enemy until he returned. Now, she goes on to say that when Bahman hurried back to the capital because the news had reached him that Ardashir III was sick, therefore, as one of the leaders of the Parsec, he was in fact returning to the capital to aid Sharvaraz and the Nimruzi faction in toppling the child king. Hence, based on the Sasanian chronological indicators, the Battle of Ulays took place at the time when Sharvaraz had mutinied and was about to take over Ctesiphon in his bid for power, that is around April 630. So this is excellent in terms of evidence. We get a really precise dating, not just the year, but we get the month as well. So clearly the Sen is incorrect in saying it happened in 633. The Arabian and the Iranian sources don't lie.
This is a perfect example of exactly what we're saying. This is what you would expect. Here is a guy, he's supposed to go to battle. He gives it over to someone else so he can return back to Ctesiphon, the capital, to take over, knowing that the child king is dying. Ardashir III is dying, and he wants to be there to make sure that his factions get into power. You would expect this. This is exactly what happens. That's why you trust it. That's why it makes sense. That's why, and the date is correct. And I can see then why Pourshariati is saying we need to go to this, because it doesn't make sense if you're saying that this is happening with rebellions that are happening against Muhammad having died, and therefore Islam is they don't want Islam imposed on them. No, this kind of story makes a lot more sense, because this is exactly what does happen over and over and over again in a context of usurping a power and a vacuum that exists within a political party or political entity.
Yeah. So just to kind of bring this home to people, we have massive chaos among the Persians. We have two major factions. They have a tension that literally goes back 5 centuries. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, we have leaders like Ardashir who are basically in power for a very short length of time. And then there's a fight for the next leader, and that leader maybe lasts a few months and then is replaced. In the space of 4 years, they go through about a half a dozen different leaders. So this is perfect. If you're in Arabia and you're looking at this chaos going on, and the trade route all the way to China is running through this territory, what are you going to do? Are you going to sit back and do nothing? Are you going to take advantage of their weakness and say, we'll go in there and we'll take over the key locations along the trade route, because that's the lucrative area that we really want to get hold of, because the Arabs, if they're anything, they're most interested in the trade route, the Silk Route that runs through all of these places. So that's what the game is. It's not about taking over Iran per se. And in fact, there are sources that back this up that Pourshariati talks about. The Arabs even say to the Iranians, we'll pay you the taxes, we'll let you put your ruler in place, but just allow us to have this trading post. That's all we're interested in. Now, it does change later, a century or two later. They decide, actually, we want to take over the whole land. But initially, that's all they were interested in. And if you were a Parthian at that time, and you were thinking, well, the Arabs have been very reasonable. They'll let us rule they'll help us kick the Sasanians out. You know, we just give them a little trading post. That's a great deal. You know, if you want to rule, you have an incentive there to play ball with the Arabs, even though you might view it now as they're betraying their own people. But at the time, they didn't see what was coming later. So it's a kind of, we can sort of make sense of this much more if we view it in terms of the sources and not through the Islamic narrative, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so let's continue from there then. Right, so the next battle is the Battle of Makir. I wasn't able to get a definite on where the location is, but I'm supposing that it was around the Hira area, or Kufa, around that sort of neck of the woods. But if anyone out there knows exactly where it is, please just confirm if I'm right or wrong. But it certainly makes logical sense to place it there because of all the other battles going along the Euphrates. But in any case, Pourshariati says in the Battle of Makir, which according to Saif took place subsequent to the Battle of Ulais, Azad B, the Marsban of Hira, who also fought at the Battle of Ubulla, set out to dam the Euphrates. Azbi, however, also impelled to flee by the news that reached him about the death of Ardashir III, as well as the defeat of his own son. So the mutiny of Shahvaraz, with the collaboration of the Parsec against Ardashir III in 630, therefore seriously interrupted the Iranian defense against the encroaching Arabs. The series of defenses put up by Bahman, Jaban, and Azad B were disrupted by the factionalism engulfing the Sasanian domains, preoccupying the three armies of the realm: the army of Atrapatkan, connected with Azerbaijan, of Shahvaraz, and of Nimruz. This allowed the Arabs to take the region of Hira through skirmishes and negotiations. Essentially, because the Persians were so divided, the Arabs basically were able to take over this area. The Persians would have easily have defeated them if they had been united at this time. As the piecemeal affairs against Hira were taking place and Khalid had conquered one side of the Sawad, Saif informs us he sent a letter to the Persians who were then at Al-Madain or Ctesiphon, disputing and supporting different parties because of the death of Ardashir III. So to conclude, we see there that the dating is clearly 630. So we move on now to the Battle of Vey Ardashir. The Sind says it happened in 12 AH or 634 AD. Now you notice that we're now saying 634 and not 633 because of the overlap of the year of the Arab from one year into the other, because they didn't have a new year in January, okay? While preoccupied with their disputes in the capital, the Persians nevertheless did send Bahman Jadhuyi to Bahur Rasir, accompanied by the forces of Asad B. It is the Parsec leader Bahman Jadhuyi, therefore, who nevertheless returned to the war front to engage the Arabs. She goes on to say that the Persians, Saif continues, were left split after the death of Ardashir III regarding the kingship, but in agreement on fighting Khalid and supporting each other. This state of affairs continued for a year while the Muslims were penetrating up to the Tigris. The Persians held nothing between Al-Hira and the Tigris. If indeed the Persians were preoccupied with this state of affairs for a year, this then takes us to the time that Buran Dukt became queen. Saif confirms this. After a year of warfare, Khalid left Iraq and went to Syria at around the same time that Buran Dukt had come to power. As we saw earlier, this was sometime in July 630. So again and again, we see that the dating makes sense. According to the Hijra dating provided by Saif, however, Khalid would have departed on the 13th of January 634 CE, or 12 AH. However, she says, what, however, was happening during this year, according to Saif, while Khalid stayed in office for a year before his departure for Syria, the Persians were overthrowing kings and enthroning others, there being no defensive effort except at Bahur Rasir. And she goes on, and how did this state of affairs come about? That was because Seruhi Kubad had slain all his male relatives descended from Khusrow II, and the people of Persia had risen after Kubad and after Ardashir. So what makes, much of the chaos is the fact that the descendants of Khusrow II were slain, which led to a dispute over who then is entitled to take up the throne. There was no clear front runner as a result. Okay, so I don't know if you want to comment on this, but basically we spoke about the fact that the Persians were divided, but a very important reason why they were divided, apart from the division between the Parthians and the Sasanians, was the fact that Khusrow's descendants were being killed off, and so therefore it was open to both sides then to push forward a new contender, but none of them had a natural right to rule, and so therefore it was open season in terms of who should rule. That was part of the reason for the chaos at that time.
Yeah. Now this is what happens whenever there is a vacuum, and in this case there is a vacuum of power, and legitimately so. You can then understand why people were leaving battles, why they were coming in and they were confronting others, because they wanted to make sure that their family, their people, their party was in power. So nothing surprising here. This is history 101. You'll go to any part of the world. This is not unique to the Sasanians, but fascinating that this is not how the Standard Islamic Narrative puts it or looks at it.
Absolutely. So they've got a sense there was chaos happening. They put it down to an apostasy war. So they put it in Islamic terms, but actually the reality is it's purely, as you said earlier, it's a political issue. Okay.
The comeback that Muslims may say, and I could understand that, is, well, okay, apostasy war, Islam is a political nature. It's a political beast. Therefore, apostasy is not just something that's theological, it's also political. And that when you confront the man, you're also confronting the God, and you're confronting the whole political structure. You're confronting the Caliphate. So to confront the Caliph also confronts the Caliphate. That's what their comeback is. In this case, there's nothing about a theological caliph in this case. These are kings who are vying and jockeying for power, similar to what would happen in every exchange or every movement. It's interesting that we're doing this recording on the day that just the day after the Queen has died and the King of England or Britain has now come to power.
Yes.
And I just noticed that a few minutes ago that he's bringing in some real changes, some new changes in his first speech. This is going to cause some furore in certain quarters. If that has happening even today, we're seeing it happen even today as we speak.
Yes.
Then why are we surprised that this should be happening among the Sasanians back in the 7th century?
Yeah. And I suppose one last point on this is just simply the chaos is happening among the Persians. It's not happening among the Arabs. So it's not an apostasy war among Arabs fighting among themselves. It's the Persians where this is really happening. And somehow it got muddled up. And it's being projected onto the Arabs, which
to be fair,
yeah,
Muslims will say that there is that chaos, and that's the Shiite-Sunni divide. Who does take over the power, the reign of power? Who does take the mantle of Muhammad? Is it his family or is it the ulema? But that is something that will come centuries later. That the whole Shiite-Sunni divide does not really get into until the 9th and 10th century, though it's again redacted back to this time period. It's then adapted back down unto Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali.
And actually, I think this period of chaos provides an excellent place to project it back to. So they can use that as a as an origin story, if you like, for the later Shia Sunni thing.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's a whole new thing you can pull out of this. Well done, Mel. This could be if you're having if you're having the heirs of Khusrau vying for those who would like to take power outside of Khusrau's heirs. Could that be the model that then became the Sunni Shia divide?
Yeah, I think personally they simply they're being ahistorical here. They have a dispute much later, develop at a different time for different reasons. They need to explain where the origin of this came, and they just simply say, well, here's the time of chaos. This must have been when it all happened.
But if this really did happen, if you did have this idea, the one who should be in power should be the descendant of Khusrau versus others who say no.
Oh, yeah.
That's what the Shiite Sunni divide becomes later on. You notice, and that's
yes,
what it is
yeah.
today.
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah. I hadn't actually thought that one through. Yes, I see where you're going. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So could this be the model where that later became?
It does make perfect sense. Yeah, it'd be interesting.
And this really did happen because that would be a huge question amongst the Sasanians. Who does have legitimate power? It has to be someone within the family. Well, we know that because you're British. British know it always happens. You know exactly who is coming the next and who will be coming second, third, fourth, and fifth. Well, if that is the case, why then is there this problem at this time period in the 628, 629, 630? Why was this going on? Obviously, because this became question. It was a question. Should we just follow Khusrau's lineage or should we bring other people who are more capable? That is the question behind the Shiite Sunni, which then is what has been redacted back onto this. And I would suggest maybe that's where the model came from. Maybe that's where the idea came from.
Yeah, excellent. And you know what I've noticed as well? If you just think about the parallel between Khusrow and the Muhammad character, if we accept this Hijra dating, that 618, then 4 years back from 632 is 628. Who died in 628? Khusrow II. So this period of chaos happened after the death of Khusrow II. And there's a dispute about who should lead. One party says it's the descendants of Khusrow. The same as with the Sunni Shia argument, it should be the descendants of the Prophet. Others say, no, it should be, other factions for whatever, and their own particular right to rule. So it's
okay.
The parallel is quite...
Yeah. I'm going to add something else to this.
Yeah.
Stop and look at the coins. Look at the coins at the period of Muawiyah. Look at the coins at the period of Muawiyah. Who does he have on the back side of his coins? I'm sorry, on the front side of his coins. Khusraw II.
Oh, yeah.
Is that also not a political statement saying that Muawiyah is making a statement here? That Muawiyah, because he is the one that makes these coins, and he only makes these coins in the mints that are in Iran. What is today Iran? He doesn't do this on the mints that are in the West. That are in Syria. His coins are very clear. Those are Christian coins, and they have the cross, and he himself is a Christian. And in fact, he puts that, and he says the contender of the faith on the inscription that he puts there in the dam there in Taif with the cross right there, and calls himself as the commander of the believers. Which ones? Well, look at the cross there, the Christians. But over there in the east, which is part of his territory, he is aware that this problem is going on. No wonder, maybe that is the reason why he puts Khusraw's image on it. Is that to say that it really is legitimate, that this context, that this confrontation that's going on, he's taking sides on this.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so we're just going to continue from
Anyways,
here.
much to unpack for later time. But this, I mean, as you're bringing this stuff up, it's starting to fit the context of what we're looking at in the days that we're looking at, both not only with these categories that you're seeing in the writings that are coming up from that time period, but also as we have now noticed with the coins, which could then spell something to do with how that was reinterpreted to be a religious faction, or not a religious faction, a political counter between the two different religious factions known as Shiite and Sunnis later on.
She says, what then happened to Khalid's correspondence with the kings of Persia? When his dispatch fell into the hands of the people of Al-Madin, the women of Khusrow's family spoke up. They put none other than Al-Faruqzad bin al-Bindawan in charge until such time as Khusrow's family agreed on a man to make king if they could find him. She says, for a whole year after the disposition of Ardashir III, the Iranian realm was then in turmoil. For at least 3 months during this period, the Parthian Shahrbaraz, in fact, usurped the Sasanian throne. Saif subsequently follows the course of the events, filling in the lacunae for this 1 year, for not only was Khalid still in charge on the Arab side, and hence had not yet left for Syria, but also on the Persian side, the participants remained the same. And so to conclude this battle, again, we see that the Sen says it happened in 634, and the sources indicate clearly 630 AD. We're almost there. In terms of the battles, we have the Battle of Anbar. The Sen says it happened in 634. Pourshariati says, as Saif's prior report had insisted, during this time, Bahman Jadhuyi continued to lead the isolated war efforts of the Sasanians against the Arabs. And according to the sources, it occurred in 630 AD. So again, we see a consistent 4-year gap. The Battle of Ain Tamir. She says the context of the subsequent Battle of Ain Tamir tallies best with the short period during which Shahrbaraz was in power, which she gives a very precise date again, April to June 630. After the Battle of Anbar, Khalid proceeded to Ain Tamir, which was defended by a Parthian Mithranid called Mihran bin Bahram Juban, clearly a descendant of Bahrami Juban, who was a rebel from a few decades before. And so in conclusion of this, we have a clear date, April to June of 630, and yet the Sen is out by 4 years. Now we have the Battle of Firad. The Sen says it happened in 634 AD. She says that although traditionally believed to have been in 12 AH, based on Saif's Hijra dating, we propose that it actually took place during Shahrbaraz's short reign. And so in this battle, unusually, the Persian, the Byzantines, and some Arab tribes joined forces. She says that an attempted cooperation between the Byzantines and the Persians at this juncture of history is quite plausible, for Heraclius, we recall, has instigated the Miranid Shahrbaraz to usurp the throne and had promised him manpower as well. She says that the Persians found order 1 year after Khalid had come to Al-Hira, a little after Khalid's departure under the rule of Shahrbaraz, one of the relatives of Khusrow, and then under Sabur. Here Saif is actually referring to events during Shahrbaraz's reign, except that we are thrown off by the Hijra dating interjection that Khalid had departed in 634. She says, significantly, when Saif picks up his narrative here, the Arab commander in charge is not Khalid, but Mutana bin Harita. Ibn al-Athir notes that Mutana came to Hira after Khalid had left for Iraq. She says, now Shahrbaraz sent a huge army against Mutana, this time commanded by Hormuz. The character of Hormuz's army is quite significant. It was made up of mere keepers of chickens and swine. The names of the putative commanders are given as Al-Kawabada and Al-Kukba, which are amended to Al-Karukba and Al-Karukba by Tabari's editor. And again, sorry if I'm pronouncing those wrong. She says the whole point of the story, however, is that Shahrbaraz's army was made up of mostly plebeian soldiers, as Mutana observes, the rabble, who were nothing but keepers of chickens and swine. Kab and Kuk are in fact the Persian terms for chicken and swine respectively, and the suffix bad means a guardian or a keeper. No need to amend here. Some knowledge of Persian, however, would have helped in distinguishing names of genuine historical figures from fictional or symbolic names, as in the case here. So she was able to identify that these are, if you like, symbolic names to represent the idea that they were a leader of low-ranking people, very low-ranking people from society at that time, keepers of chickens and swine, in other words. So she goes on to say, once he assumed power, and especially since he usurped power, Shahrbaraz was left with very little support, as evidenced by his short rule of 3 months. Apparently, he was not able to bring to the war front enough manpower to put up a defense against the Arab armies, hence his use of the rabble and groups of people who had no knowledge of warfare. And there are more indicators of factionalism amongst the Persians. She says that Butana and Shahrbaraz reportedly exchanged letters at this juncture. Saif then provides us with further significant internal indicators of factionalism. The Persians admonished Shahrbaraz, "You have encouraged our enemy against us by what you wrote to them. When you write to anyone, consult us first." Saif informs us that Shahrbaraz was killed around the same time that Hormuz was defeated in June 630. So therefore, we can say that this battle occurred in 630 AD. Now, so I'm obviously not going to go through all of the battles, but we have here a very useful table given by Pourshariati, and the section in red there, as you can see, are the years, the correct years, as it were, of all of the battles. She also has the various Persian rulers that were in place at that time. And we have the names of the battles here on the left-hand side. So this is really helpful and just confirms that her dating is very accurate indeed. Okay. So I would suggest that the Sen narrative, the Standard Islamic Narrative here, has got these dates very wrong. They're about 4 years out in every case. And so, was Saif's history doctored later, or was the Hijra dating changed? I think, as I mentioned really at the beginning, Saif's testimony was accurate. It makes no sense for him to get the Persian monarchical rulers so correct and yet to get the Hijra wrong. I think when he mentions the Hijra year, he meant from 618 AD, not 622 AD. So we're going to move on to the evidence for why I believe the year began in 618 AD. Yeah. Okay, so here is evidence for why the Hijra really was 618. We got outside sources right up to 754 AD that claim that the year of the Arabs began in 618. So we got the Hispanic Chronicles from 754. It says clearly there, as you can see, the Saracens rebelled in 618, the 7th year of the Emperor Heraclius, and appropriated for themselves Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. We got a second source, the Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 741, relying on the Syriac common source, and it says, in the 7th year of the aforesaid ruler Heraclius, the Saracens, in rebellion and hostile to the inhabitants of the provinces of the Romans, by stealth rather than by open attacks, incite the neighboring tribes. Now, they mentioned the 7th year of Heraclius, that works out as 618 AD. So that's two sources. We also have a Chinese source. And
go back to those real quickly.
Yeah.
In both cases, do you notice these are not Ridda at all? This is not Hijra either. This is rebellion. Notice what they're calling it.
Yes.
See, even this whole thing of a movement from one city to the other that the later Standard Islamic Narratives refers, that's what they're referring to. That's what the Hijra is. None of these chronicles that are referring to from both the Hispanic or Spain and the Byzantine Arab Chronicle in 754 or 741 refer to them as Hijra. This is rebellions against the powers that be. Again, this is a political act.
Absolutely. And it's completely political. It's not, this idea that the immigrated from one city to another that's missing the point.
Nothing about immigration here. You notice that? Nothing.
No. Yeah. Now, obviously, if you rebel and go on various raids, there's a certain element of movement from one location to another, but it isn't specifically between two particular cities. I think this is...
And certainly nothing between Mecca and Medina.
No.
The rebellions are all much further north.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking really northern Arabia, Syria, and Mesopotamia, which is Iraq.
Just so people know, whenever they refer to Syria or Arabia, Arabia in the 7th century had nothing to do with the central part of Arabia today. It's not the Arabia we have today. It's Arabia Petraea. Arabia Petraea was always the northern part of Arabia. The part where Mecca and Medina, where supposedly all of this is supposedly happening, is called Arabia Deserta. Deserta means desert. For a reason. There's no one living there. You don't live in a desert, as I've said many times, because there's no water. So both this Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 741 and the Hispanic Chronicle of 754, referring to them as Saracens, again, not Muslims, you notice that.
Yeah.
These are Saracens. They are up in the north, rebellion. It's a political rebellion, and it's in Arabia Petraea. Syria and Arabia is Arabia Petraea, just the northern part of what would be part of Jordan and just skirting down as far down as Tabuk, the city of Tabuk today.
Okay, so another source. This is the original in Chinese. It's actually from a 651 envoy record from the Dashi, which is in a Chinese record called the Ju Tang Shu. In the second year of Yanggu era, 651, the Dashi began to send envoys to pay tributes. The king's surname is Dashi, which is equivalent of the Tayaye, and his first name is Kanmi Muani. The envoys said that it had been 34 years since the establishment of the kingdom, during which time the crown had been passed down to 3 kings. Look at 651, take away 34, and you get 617, 618. Now, it says 34 years since, so that would be 618, essentially. So it's not in the year, it's not saying 34 years in the year of the Arab, it's saying 34 years since the establishment. So that's 618 again, and this is a very early source. Okay. Now we also have this from the Samarkand, so way off now to the east. Okay, the ruler of the Samarkand wrote to the Tang Emperor and said it was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Taye Kingdom. The letter was from the ruler of Kang requesting military assistance from the Tang Emperor in the year 719. The letter says that this year, 719, is the exact 100 years since the founding of the Dashi. So therefore we conclude that the Taye was founded in 618. 619 would be the first year since the founding of the Dashi, and if you keep going up, you'll eventually get to 100 at 719. So they definitely mean 618, okay? Now, what all these pieces of evidence suggest is that the beginning of the Tayaye kingdom was in 618 and certainly not in 622. Pourshariati ignored the AH and looked at the other evidence, but what if we take the AH seriously, or the Anno Hijra, but instead take the other sources that put year 1 of the Arabs at 618. Let's run it as an experiment and compare the dates with Pourshariati's. So just to confirm, I've put here the year of the Arabs. So AD is on the left-hand side. I have 618, 619 because of the way that their year of the Arab didn't start in January, with some time during the year. So obviously there's an overlap. Okay, and what I did was I took the evidence and plugged it into a table and then compared it with Pourshariati. The section that's in orange is the time that it probably overlaps from the sort of the end of one year and into the next year. Okay, so we got the Battle of Abulla. Okay, so 12 AH. If we put the old AH, which is starting for 618, we get 629. How does it compare? Pourshariati says 628. And if you look all the way down, you notice that it pretty much hits nail on the head in every case. 629, 629, 630, 630, 630, 630. It all lines up. It's quite amazing. When I saw this, I was speechless. So I hope this makes sense. We can actually trust Saif after all. If Saif was talking about the old AH, which is starting in 618, then he was actually telling it as it is. Pourshariati didn't think of this. She didn't think of the idea that there was another Hijra, which was 618. She just assumed 622 was the Hijra and left it at that and just ignored and thought it was wrong. But actually, if you take 618 as the beginning, now it makes sense. All the battles are correctly dated by her and also by Saif.
Okay, well, this is exactly what we're all doing, and this is what you've done such a great job of. I thanks so much, Mel. You've gone through 10 different battles, and you're showing by the battles where this Parvaneh Pourshariati or Pourshariati, however you want to pronounce her last name, in her book, The Decline and Fall of the Sasanian Empire, completely confronts this idea of the RIDDA Wars to begin with. Let's just start with the RIDDA War, then we'll go to the Hijra. The RIDDA Wars as something that happened 632, 633, immediately after Muhammad's death. And she said, no, these happened before 632. These all happened 628, 629, 630. And why? Because just look at the Sasanian accounts. Look at the historical accounts that are written from that time period by people who actually were there at that time. They would obviously know it better than somebody who's writing, as we now know, the Standard Islamic Narrative doesn't even begin to appear till the 9th and 10th century. So are we going to trust 9th and 10th century writers redacting it back with an agenda in mind, as we've been saying, because there is an agenda here. They want to make sure that this is a religious war, a war of apostasy. They even, Ridda means apostasy. They don't want it to be a political conflict. And yet, historically, when you get to the 7th century, you will see that everything about it is straight history. It is history as it actually happened. And since that is the case, Pourshariati is asking a very, very salient question. She's not saying let's therefore throw out the Standard Islamic Narrative. We're saying that. So we're coming to the conclusion. She's very careful not to come to the conclusion. Being a scholar, she has to do that. Our job, Mel, is to take it one step further, come to conclusions, and then let those who are listening, you then either accept or disagree. You've also not only with those two graphs that you have at the end there, those are great graphs because you've done a great job of putting it side by side by side by side and saying, hold on a minute, there's also another problem, because when he's talking about the year of the Arab, the year of the Arab is really when the Arabs started really moving themselves out and moving out and saying, now we can control our own destiny. We can do that because Heraclius has done us a great job. The Byzantines have done us a great job of weakening the Sasanians. And more than that, that's going to happen in 622 when finally he eradicates it and destroys their power. But here's the year of the Arab. We've always thought it was, we've always assumed that the year of the Arab was the equivalent to the Hijra. And that's why she just threw it out. Pourshariati just threw it out because it doesn't fit. What you have done is you've gone one step further and said, hold on, it does fit if you look at these 4 documents. And I love it. You got the document of the Hispanics from 754. You got the Byzantine Arab document from 741. You have the Chinese, way as far as China, from 651. And then you have the Samarkand document from 719. In every case, if you follow back what they're saying, because they are actually having contact with these people. The Chinese are having contact with these Daesh, the Samarkand, all those people, they know what's happening there, and they're speaking about this. And in every case, when you look and see the years that they are putting into, it puts it back to 718, 719, between those 2 years, which then would make it about 4 years prior to what then later became the Hijra. So it is a second Hijra that you're adding to this debate. Thank you for that, because that now makes sense. So you've gone one step further even than what Pourshariati does. I'm not surprised. You tend to do that anyways. You kind of take what people say and say, well, you haven't you haven't filled out the whole problem. There's still another problem. That is, what are we going to do with the dating of the year of the Arab? Thanks for doing that. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think because of what you've done here, this is just showing yet another nail in the coffin of the Standard Islamic Narrative. The Standard Islamic Narrative not only gets its history wrong, it gets its dates wrong, and it's wrong people. And in this case, it even is confused as to what's going on. a political tussle that's happening in a void that exists makes sense, but it's a political tussle nonetheless, and they make it into a religious entity, a religious reformation, you might say, when even the documents from that time period don't refer to it as a religious reformation. They call it a rebellion not by Muslims, but rebellion by the Saracens, which all the more suggests, let's go back to the evidence from the 7th century. Let's go back to the evidence that existed at that time, and let's follow where that evidence leads. You've done a great job by doing that today. Thanks so much, Mel. This has been fun.
I think one of the things I'd like to draw out from this is something that hasn't really been thought about. It's this idea that the Hijra dating had to have been changed at some point, because there's clearly a record there of thinking of it starting in 618. We saw, a record from 751, I think it was 752. Even the historian Saif, who we read from today, he dies towards the end of the 8th century. So he's still operating according to the old AH. Yeah. So the new AH must have come in later, the 9th, 10th century. Who brought it in? I don't know. It was certainly an Abbasid leader. They had an agenda. For some reason they wanted to switch it, but I think that's worth exploring if it's possible at this stage in history to find out who was the person who made that switch.
Well, stop and think that through. The Hispanic Arab document that you refer to as 754. That's way over in the western part of the empire. Yeah. That is not under the Abbasids. The Abbasids would not have had any jurisdiction over there. Yeah. The Byzantine document is 741. That's even before the Abbasids come into power. Sorry, the Abbasids come into power in 749, really 749, 750. Yeah. So you can see that even predates that. So that makes sense that they would not be under their jurisdiction and they would be a lot more clear and a lot more accurate in the dating that they're giving.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Listen, thanks so much, Mel. Now, first, people, you're going to have some reactions. Mel's putting this up on his site. I'll be putting up on my site. He go to Origins. That's his site. Those of you who are there are already seeing him on Origins. Others of you are in PfanderFilms who are watching it here. Make your comments, and both Mel and I will be looking at the comments. And try to respond to them as best we can. It's been a long time since we've had you here, Mel. Great to have you back again. Let's go ahead and let's get some more of this stuff up, and let's let people react to it. God bless you. This has been great. I'm here in Brazil, 4 hours ahead, behind you. You're always ahead of me, and you're way over there in Ireland. It's good that, it looks like we're right next door. We can shake hands. Thanks so much, Mel, for coming on board. Thanks so much for introducing this to us, and thanks so much for bringing me along with you. This is Mel and Jake, thousands of miles apart, over and out.